So the time has come for our final discussion, where we'll sort of move from the evaluation nerds, I think you called yourselves, to the practitioners, the people who are actually having to try to use this evidence. So I want to welcome up on stage Jillian Popkins, who's from the UK. She's the Chief Commissioner at the UK Independent Commission for Aid Impact, and Professor Jörg Faust, who is the director of the German Institute for Development Evaluation, and back on stage, Professor Rachel Glennerster. Welcome back. So our focus now for this last half hour or so is to discuss how research and evaluation inform, or sometimes fails to inform, governance, steering, and day-to-day management of aid. The central question is not only what we know, but how that knowledge is translated into decisions. And ICAI, that you represent, and Deval, you're both sort of EBA's sister organizations. So maybe if we start with a question around your organizations have different mandates. So maybe Jillian, you first. How does your mandate influence how you think about influencing policy and interventions?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a really fascinating day with lots of stimulus. So I'll try, as I answer the questions, to sort of pull in some of the things that I've heard and learned today. But basically, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact is the UK's aid scrutiny body, and we're independent. We sit at arm's length from government and report directly into the UK Parliament, into a select committee that then uses our evidence along with their own inquiries to hold ministers and senior officials to account and ask questions informed by our evidence of how the UK development cooperation programme is delivering impact and, importantly, doing that at best value for money. So that's basically what we do. We look at the UK's official development assistance spending, but our mandate's also been expanded to align with our government's new approach to look at partnerships, to look at the use of expertise and engagement with policy. So that presents a new set of challenges in terms of thinking about impact. And we can look at that activity across the whole of the UK government, so where it's spending, ODA in particular. So I think that gives you a sense of what we do, of what our mandate is, and how we do that is through reviews that we commission. So I decide with my fellow commissioners what we're going to look at. That's a key part of our independence. And then we independently bring in teams of experts to conduct those reviews for us.
Mm-hmm. Same question to you, Professor Faust. How does your mandate influence how you work with evidence and interventions?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here and being able to thank you very much for having me here and being able to kind of contribute a little bit to your discussion. I think one thing is the mandate. The second thing is where are you financed from? Where are your sources of finance? The third thing is your reporting lines. And there is also a fifth thing is how you are able to play with these institutional surroundings. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the German Institute for Development Evaluation, we have a triple mandate. So core is strategic evaluations. We do recommendations for the ministry, for GIZ and for KfW mainly from our evaluations. Evaluations go directly to Parliament, so there's a double reporting line, and we have then a certain common management response system and a monitoring system about the implementation of recommendations. So we do have a follow-up, a structured follow-up system of what happens with the recommendation. So that's basically the core issue. We have also the status of a federal research institute, and that's why we also have this field of kind of promoting methods and standards of evaluation. That's why we are in the RCT business to a certain degree. And the final one, and that if you may miss a little bit in the discussion today, is evaluation capacity development. We hear a lot about how to provide evidence to the government and to the taxpayer, but I mean, who is affected by our programs? It's those people over there, yeah, in these poor countries. So how are they are and their decision makers involved in evidence creation, in evidence selection, and in selecting the methods. Trying to promote a little bit capacity of evaluation to partner countries is a way of overcoming the donor-driven bias, which I think do heavily exist in development evaluation, and which is even further promoted by the scarce resources, which tend to make governments and decision makers to look even stronger at the taxpayer or the voter and lesser to those who are affected by interventions. Thank you.
Maybe then a question to all of you based on what we've discussed throughout the day today. Is the main problem, and maybe starting with you, is the main problem that we lack evidence or that we don't use evidence? And maybe some reflections on how can we usefully translate existing evidence into policy that managers can use.
Thanks. Well, I guess economists are quite good at saying it's a bit of both. But, so there are areas where we have a lot of evidence. The amount of evidence has grown dramatically. You heard the example of microcredit, which when we started JPAL, we sat down and said, what are the biggest questions that we have where there isn't enough evidence, where there's a mismatch between the amount of spending that's going on and the evidence, and microcredit was first on our list, so that was a priority for us. So, but now there's tons. So we've made a lot of progress. So I think it used to be that there wasn't enough evidence, and there are still areas where we don't have enough evidence. The use of evidence is, there's, given the amount of evidence we have, there's a big gap in terms of use. And as I say, we've been talking a lot about aid today, but as others have said, the real issue is, what's happening to people on the ground. And for me, that's, the biggest win is getting low and middle income country governments to use that evidence. And some of them are now becoming incredibly sophisticated at using that evidence, and some of them aren't. So I think when we think about capacity, there's a lot to be done in improving the capacity of low and middle income governments to use the evidence that there is. And there is, for me, the biggest challenge is this gap between a particular study and what I should do. That it's not that in any given question that you have, you can just look up the perfect study in that country that tells you what to do. Like, that's never the case. You've always got to do some extrapolation. Looking at what other countries have had similar problems, or you are worrying about how to get teachers to show up, and there's not much evidence on how to get teachers to show up, but there's lots of evidence on how to get health workers to show up. And so you extrapolate from health workers to teachers. So that extrapolation is not easy, and it takes skill. And that is, when I was working in the UK government, that was where I felt that there was most need for improving people's skills. But I think as a community that generates the evidence, we also should do more of that. And the trick is to not think of these studies as individual studies, but as telling us something about underlying human behavior. That's why you can move from health workers to teachers. Obviously, there are different things in schools and health and clinics, but you learn something about what motivates people to show up. And so, for example, selecting the right workers is one of the biggest ways that you can improve attendance, because if you get more motivated people into the labor force, you don't need to do all this monitoring, and a lot of monitoring isn't very effective. So that's an example of how you understand the underlying principles, and that helps you extrapolate to new situations. So I think there's still quite a lot of work that we need to do in helping people understand how to use the evidence that there is. It's not straightforward.
No. Jillian, what's the discussion in the UK on this? Do you recognize some of the questions that we've been discussing here from sort of the Swedish context and the challenge of translating evidence into actual policy and strategy?
Yes, I do. I recognise them all and more. And it's really interesting for me as someone who sits in the scrutiny architecture. So as someone who was and has had a career as a development practitioner and brings a lot of tacit knowledge to this role in terms of understanding how things work in practice, in country programmes, in policy, and all of the different ways that we work in development cooperation as donors. But now that I sit in the scrutiny architecture, I guess I have an overarching objective, which is to think about, which is my mandate, which is to think about how we do achieve as much impact as possible, at the best possible value for money for the people whose lives we want to see improved and for the UK taxpayer. So this kind of double accountability that we sit in. And I also sit at the interface between the department and Parliament, so the policy and the politics. So there's a lot of thinking about how you translate evidence for different audiences. Yeah. And I think the one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is my audiences. So how can I make really good evidence and data available to a parliamentary audience, to my minister, and also to those officials and others who've contributed to the review process that ICAI has led, and also, of course, honour the contributions that other groups have made, either directly or through their representatives who've not influenced the process so much. So there's quite a lot going on in all of that, as well as some of the things we've talked about today, like making sure that we've really understood what rigor means, that we know what we're saying when we talk about impact. So I don't know if that helps, but it sort of gives you a sense of the way that we think about how we sit in the architecture. And the final point I would make is that as a scrutiny body that reports to Parliament, we sit alongside our National Audit Office, so we work very closely with the auditors to make sure that we're looking specifically at development impact and complementing what they're doing. And sometimes they will pick up issues that we've surfaced in a review, but they are better suited to really drill into from a public financial management perspective. And we also work very closely with some of the functions that I think my colleague from Germany has within his body. We work closely with those functions within the FCDO, the Development Department in the UK government, to make sure that we know what systems we're feeding into, so that our work is as well aligned as possible with the other bits of the system.
And you mentioned yourself, you brought up funding as an important factor in how you think about evidence and influencing policy making. Do you want to elaborate a bit further on that? How?
I mean, funding is simply important because, I mean, Deval is a government funded body, and that has implications for your institutional setup. Yeah, so you may talk about limits of independence because of your funding resources, or you may talk about specific needs then to build very powerful fire lines for protecting your independence. But I mean, the nature of funding has consequences for how you work and how your institutional setup should be in order to provide useful, independent, and credible evidence. So it's one core issue. But to your overarching question, I think the nexus between evidence and evidence take-up, I mean, there are three issues. One is actually highlighted is how do you transport existing evidence? So basically, to whom do you speak? Yeah, and identifying what is his or her interest, what is his or her need, and that obviously differs structurally if you talk to a parliamentarian or if you talk to a project manager. So it's the success of evidence transportation depends on the packaging according to the recipient. That's one point. Second point is the evidence architecture. I mean, we have tons of RCTs and quasi-experimental things, and we have been trying to build up an architecture out of which we can extract evidence for different needs. So there's the single RCT informing a project and probably bringing some innovation, but there's also the systematic review where you try to condense several RCTs or several evaluations in a certain field for a certain instrument. So that's evidence on a higher level. Then you have evidence maps. And then on top you have new evidence portals. Yeah? So a whole range, yeah, of evidence stuck into one portal. And obviously this can be, with the use of AI and so on and so forth, used for even higher and more strategic questions. So the issue of how do we organize our evidence, the existing evidence, to tackle specific questions of specific audiences will become more and more important the more evidence exists. And the final one is the incentives for take-up. I mean, we evaluators run around preoccupied, how can we bring those policymakers to take up the evidence? Burdensome issue. Yeah, so, but actually the other thing would be much easier. How do we bring decision makers and policymakers, how do we introduce incentives into their systems so they come to us? And I think this is the crucial thing. So it's, I always say, okay, we are doing a lot to kind of bring the evidence to the decision makers. It would be much easier if we kind of would be able to incentivize them to come to the evidence providers. And that's what Rachel has meant to some extent, and that's really crucial. And the bureaucracies have to think on how to change in order to switch this relationship.
Gillian, it looks like you want to follow up on that question of incentives.
Yeah, and I think it's the way that I think about it is, and it really sits in the question of, really difficult question of how do you maintain your independence when you're funded by the department. But it's really being able to demonstrate your usefulness and remembering that usefulness comes from challenge as well as, you know, from providing evidence. So that you're really understanding what it is that what are the issues that the ministers are dealing with that are aligned with the policy objectives they have, which at the end of the day are not within my mandate to comment on. So really understanding how you can be useful and what the purpose of the independent evaluation is, which at the end of the day is a shared purpose. It's better impact, it's better value for money. And then making sure that your purpose is clear so that when you design your research questions, they are, you know, rigorous and all of the things that, using the right methodologies and all of the things that we heard about earlier, but they're actually serving a purpose. And I think, you know, you asked about Sweden and the UK earlier, and I think one of the comments that I would make from my experience in this role in the last year has been that there are a set of generic issues around the kinds of ways that an independent scrutiny body like ICAI works, and then there are a set of very context-specific issues at the moment in the development sector as a whole, but I think we're feeling particularly acutely in the UK because of the very dramatic reduction in the ODA budget and the restructuring development agency as well. And the key thing is, how do we, reviews by their nature look backwards. They look at the past and they learn from their past. But we know that the future already looks very, very different. So how do we get the balance of accountability and learning right in a way that understands what are the issues that ministers and officials are grappling with at the moment in the sort of realities that they're dealing with? So I was very struck by the presentation earlier about talking about you're dealing with the present, but you're always thinking about what the next step needs to be. And I think, as a scrutiny body, we've had to, and it's been good to think, how can we be more forward focused without losing the accountability, because gone are the days when we could take a year to do a review and know that the findings would roll into a fairly stable 3-year country programme process, or even a sort of working through the same instruments anymore.
And I read that maybe ICAI...
So our funding is being considered at the moment, as all of the funding is within the UK ODA budget. So I don't know whether I would be standing here in front of you in a few weeks' time. The function of independent scrutiny remains, because it's part of our legislative requirements in the UK. The question is, how is that delivered, and is it delivered for best value for money for the taxpayer, which is a very legitimate question for our minister to ask, as she is asking of all ODA spending at the moment. And so I'm very lucky that I inherited a very strong body of impact evidence on our own performance from my predecessors when I took up the role, because of course we do have to demonstrate that we're adding value as well. And as I said, the way that I think about that is, well, really trying to understand what are the issues that the government is dealing with, and helping them to understand how they can get the best value and impact out of the resources available to deliver those impacts.
Could I come back on the incentive point, because I've been thinking about this a lot. And with it, I just want to share the experience in the UK of the incentive to develop programs that are in line with evidence. So when you write a program document, so it starts even before that, actually. So when you design the strategies for what a sector is going to work on, there is, a thorough review of the evidence and what's cost effective. And so then the strategy is designed around those. And we've just heard, for example, I'm on a global panel on evidence on education, and that is fed into the World Bank strategy on education. So that's, you feed in at the strategy, and then when you're doing an individual project, you had to fill in a section that says, what's the evidence that this is the most effective thing that you could be doing with the money? So you have to cite the evidence in that section. And then the real stick is that goes to a special unit, the Quality Assurance Unit it's called, which is full of people who really know the evidence. I mean, the head of that unit reads the QJE for, bedtime reading. I'm not kidding you. And the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And so they review the project, and if they don't think it's based on evidence, they can decline it. They can send it back. And we did. 20% of the time we sent projects back, and we said it's not good enough, it's not sufficiently in line with the evidence. Now, I realize most agencies don't have that power, but what it really meant was that when you're writing your project, you are thinking, I've got to get it through the QAU. I've got to get it through this group that really knows the evidence. And so that was an incentive for the individual writers of those programs to even call us up and ask us about the evidence in advance, and to keep up with the evidence. And then we wrote, reports that said, this is our summary of the evidence. So they would often quote those reports, because they thought, well, if I do something in line with that report, it's more likely to get through. So I think using the review process to speed things up that are based on evidence and slow them down if they're not is a really effective incentive.
Were you thinking about those kinds of incentives or other incentives? Or did you want to come in on something else?
I would like to come in on something else.
Yes, please go ahead.
Just to give you a perhaps a little bit more provocative interpretation of what I've heard today. Actually, I heard two evidence-based stories on different types of aid. I heard a more assistentialist, philanthropic, anti-poverty narrative, which is focusing on anti-poverty measures, where it is possible to kind of identify evidence at the micro level with very rigorous methods, and if we have cost information, then to optimize them. And that's a very typical and traditional story of what development aid is about and how it should work. I nevertheless heard another equally interesting story, which is about that we do have we will reach identical levels at that level. The crucial issue is really about inclusive institutions. And the future will be driven by inclusive institutions because they are the ones who make the difference. So it's more about sustainable development, about promoting structural changes. The thing with that story is, of course, it's more long-term oriented, it's very hard to measure, it's dirty, but it may be very much rewarding, yeah, because there will be external positive effects. And so we heard two strategic narratives about the future of development cooperation. So what am I supposed to choose? Yeah. And both are probably very well grounded and founded, and they reflect the typical, let me, as a political scientist, interpret economics. They interpret the micro-macro conflict within the discipline. So the one is more macroeconomics driven, and the other one is more micro. So what am I supposed to do with two credible, evidence-based stories as a strategic decision makers? So at the end of the day, there will be some big room for discretionary political decision making left.
I think that was an invitation actually to take a few reflections and questions from all of you. Oh yes, I see lots of hands up. So let's start there with Lars, and then.
Yeah, I'm Lars Niklasson. I'm a political scientist, and I'm also with EBA. Steering and managing for results sounds a bit top-down. Is that how you think about this, that evidence should come in at the top of organizations? Or let me rephrase, what do you think about tacit knowledge that project officers hold at the bottom of organizations? Should they, is that a complement, or is evidence a substitute for tacit knowledge?
We will take 3 questions, and then you can choose in your final remarks which ones you want to answer. Or maybe we'll take 5. I don't know, you have to decide who had their hand up first.
I'll take someone.
Thank you so much. I'm Emma Elverson. I'm Associate Professor at Uppsala University, and I represent the Swedish Development Research Network. So we're a national network of researchers working on development, very broadly defined, from global health to climate adaptation to peace and security. And I think this discussion we're having now about the importance of evidence is coming at the same time as decreasing funding for research related to this. So in Sweden, we had, up until a few years ago, we had a specific earmarked funding for scholarly academic research that was sort of specifically geared at delivering actionable insights for development cooperation. That was defunded a few years ago, and SIDA's budget for research aid has drastically decreased over the past few years. Our sort of insights from our network, we have surveyed our members across Sweden, and they are saying that they are seeing the impact of this. They are changing the focus of the research to topics that are more away from development issues, right? So The question, I guess, this is a bigger question of this to policymakers about how this is supposed to add up. But I guess the question to you would be, how do you think that policymakers should act to make sure that we have a strong evidence base, to continue to have a strong evidence base for specifically development cooperation, and then to make sure that to sort of facilitate for practitioners drawing on this evidence base? Thank you.
Thank you. One more for this round.
Wow, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be the last one. So my name is Rebecca Kitzing-Ivarsson, working for CEDA, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. Actually, my question may relate a little bit more to the previous one, which relates to the methodology of impact evaluations, because there was a reference to medical research, and there, as I think we all know, they treat the problem of placebo effects. So the control group will always be giving what we call in Swedish sugar pill. So you will not know if you're actually part of the control group or the other group. But how do you actually treat the placebo effect problem when it comes to RCTs? Thanks.
3 really excellent questions. Who wants to start? And you choose which question you want to answer. Please go ahead, Jillian.
I won't answer the question about the placebo effect on RCTs. I'll leave that probably to Rachel.
Maybe tacit knowledge?
Tacit knowledge, yeah. I mean, I think it is a form of evidence, tacit knowledge, and like any other form of evidence, as long as you're using a rigorous approach to collect it, then it has validity. So I think it's important that we look at qualitative methodologies more broadly, as our colleague spoke about earlier. So I would put it in that category. I think one of the values that we're able to bring as an independent scrutiny body is that we can sort of pick up where the story that Rachel was telling left off, in a sense. So you've got all of your formal internal approval and review and evaluation processes in the program management cycle. But we can come in at any one point and say, okay, we're going to have a look at the UK's work on girls' education across a number of different contexts, and we can compare what that looks like in practice in those different contexts. And that in that example, we would be collecting perspectives from a whole range of different stakeholders at different points in the system and at different country contexts, and looking for the kinds of patterns that emerge from qualitative data collection in order to identify where the delivery systems could be improved, or where capabilities or management approaches are not squeezing the maximum value out of an approach, or indeed are leading to unintended consequences, like all the additional things that Rachel was talking about earlier that could have got added on in the process that were never part of the original design. So we're able to sort of follow through and actually sort of collect real life examples and use case studies for learning on what that looks like in practice.
Mm-hmm. Maybe for you the question, or maybe it was more of a comment, how does it add up, the increased emphasis on evidence use with cuts in funding for development research?
Well, I have no ultimate conclusion, but obviously there is an incentive in asking for more evidence-based decision makers, or proclaiming more evidence decision making when your budget goes down. Whether this kind of proclamation of increased evidence used is real, or whether it's a rhetoric in order to convince people that you are now doing serious stuff, is a question. What I perceive in certain, at least, circles is that there is a kind of a shift towards kind of giving evidence-based decision-making more weight, but at least at the political and high-level realm, there is sometimes no particular knowledge about how to kind of reorganize their institutions in order to make this proclamation work. And here's the entry door for us, because we can then use this situation as a window of opportunity to kind of make at least 5 good suggestions and hope that two will be taken up, and that we kind of advance the system in such situations in an incremental way. So yes, budget crisis at the end of the day is a window of opportunity for those interested in evidence-based policymaking.
Never waste a good crisis. Rachel, maybe you also want to answer that question, and also possibly the placebo effect problem.
Yeah, let me actually just start with the tacit knowledge, because when I talked about my 3 buckets, so evidence on what the problem is, generalized evidence about how humans behave, the last one was implementation. How can how are you going to make implementation work there? And there's a lot of tacit knowledge, local institutional knowledge that goes into that, of can this organization actually pull this off? Are clinics open enough? Just a lot of detailed knowledge about how you can make things work that goes into that last implementation bucket. And funding for research. So this is one of the things that I think is the comparative advantage of bilateral donors, generating the global evidence base, because individual countries don't have the incentive to invest in things that are going to teach the rest of the world how to do. They want to improve their own programs, but they're not taking into account all the knowledge that's going to be generated for other people. And sorry, I should also say on the tacit knowledge point, if you've ever seen any of these impact evaluations actually work in practice, we spend an enormous amount of time talking to local people before we start. Right? So when I did this girls empowerment program in Bangladesh, I hadn't worked in Bangladesh. I spent about a year just learning about what does empowerment for girls mean in Bangladesh. I talked to organizations, I talked to government, but mainly I talked to girls. Right? And so there's a huge amount of that goes in that we're not talking about, that goes into the good design of these programs. And we nearly always work with a local partner who has a lot of that detailed institutional knowledge. I want to come back to your point about this divergence between the macro and the micro, or we're not thinking about the long-term institutions. Because, I read all of that work on institutions matter, and my response was, okay, what do I tell, the people I'm working with in the government of Sierra Leone about what to do? Like, they've got bad institutions. Because of the way they were colonized, you can say that fed into it, but that doesn't help the president know what to do tomorrow. So what we did in a 2004 civil war for 10 years, we were coming out of that, and they were talking about how to build their institutions. And they were interested in decentralization, and we worked with them to try out different forms of decentralization, and which built the best, changed and increased the involvement of women in decision-making and youth in decision-making. Like, that's what they were interested in. So you can, and there are now many, many RCTs on what's the way to have women have greater voice in serious, important decisions that are made around them. And I could give a half-an-hour lecture on that, actually, because we now do have evidence. So the point is, we can actually look at these things. And lastly, on placebo, as always, an economist, they say it depends, but there is a lot of work to make sure that when we do an intervention, it's not just the fact that people are getting attention. So, I did a misinformation program recently, right? Teaching people in Sierra Leone about how to spot misinformation. Well, one group got one video about how to spot misinformation, another group got information about how vaccines work, and a third group got information about how to build a hand washing station. That was our sugar pill. they're all sitting down and being asked questions about the video and what. But how to build a hand washing station was nothing to do with what we were testing about. So that was our sugar pill. So yes, we do invent the equivalent of sugar pills often. It's possible.
Thank you. We have to round up, but before we do that, I want to let you also have a few final words. What's one enabler that you would suggest for us here in the Swedish context for integrating research and evaluation into decision making? One enabler, one thing we could work with to strengthen. Jillian, you first.
Sure, you're very good at this already in Sweden, but one thing we haven't mentioned or talked about in terms of how we get evidence into policy and practice is the importance of transparency. So, just putting good quality evidence in the public domain, as well as obviously with parliamentarians and aid agencies being transparent. There are some areas of aid, some different aid instruments tend to have different levels of transparency. So I think that's one that we really need to watch and make sure that we do continue to kind of promote openness so that we can learn as well as for accountability.
Thank you. And Jörg, final word?
Any kind of incentives which forces, which give strong incentives to decision makers and implement it to use evidence. One is kind of obligation to use evidence for program proposals. Another one would be monitoring recommendations out of evaluation in a thorough way. Yeah, these are kind of incentives which avoid that studies end up in the drawer.
Rachel, very final.
So make it easy. Humans are very good at doing things if it's easy for them to do it. This is the lesson of behavioral economics. So in this case, what does that mean? It means commissioning with other donors syntheses of the evidence that turn all this complicated, detailed academic studies into clear recommendations of what you can do in different types of context.
Perfect. Thank you so much. A big round of applause.